the border that splits neighbors in two. In Baarle-Nassau and Baarle-Hertog, residents navigate daily life with bedrooms in one country and kitchens in another, living within a complex patchwork where the Netherlands and Belgium intertwine. This documentary examines the world's most unusual international borders that slice through communities, homes, and lives. We'll journey through geographical oddities, from enclaves within enclaves to territories only accessible by traveling through another country, revealing the puzzling reality behind these border anomalies. These peculiar boundaries create practical challenges while shaping unique cultural identities for those who live there. We'll uncover how these communities adapt to their distinctive circumstances, exploring both historical origins and modern complexities of divided existence. The puzzle of the Bangladesh-India border. Imagine waking up in a town that, on paper, belongs to one country, but you're completely surrounded by another nation's territory. The only way to reach your actual homeland is by illegally crossing an international border. For thousands of residents along the Bangladesh-India border, this was daily reality in one of the world's most complex border situations. Until 2015, this border region contained something truly extraordinary, a constellation of 162 enclaves. These were small pieces of sovereign territory completely surrounded by another country. India had 106 enclaves inside Bangladesh, while Bangladesh had 92 enclaves inside India. The complexity reached mind-boggling levels with counter-enclaves, enclaves within enclaves, and even a counter-enclave, the only third-order enclave in world history. Picture this: a piece of Bangladesh completely surrounded by Indian territory, which itself was completely surrounded by Bangladesh. A geographical Russian nesting doll creating a labyrinth of borders where sovereignty changed with each invisible boundary crossed. When viewed from above, cartographers called this a leopard spot pattern, scattered territories sprinkled across the landscape like confetti thrown randomly across a map. The largest of these enclaves was Dahagram-Garpata, a Bangladeshi territory of about 4,600 people surrounded entirely by India. The smallest was a plot of land barely the size of a football field. These territorial puzzles trapped over 50,000 people in legal and political limbo. For the Mia family living in an Indian enclave inside Bangladesh, daily life meant impossible choices. When their young daughter developed a high fever, they faced either crossing an international border illegally to reach Indian hospitals or seeking treatment in Bangladesh without documentation. Like many families, they had become experts at navigating the dangerous spaces between nations just to access basic services. Enclave residents existed in a bizarre administrative vacuum. They were citizens of countries they could rarely visit. Most lacked official documentation from either country, making them effectively stateless. They couldn't vote, couldn't access government services, and lived beyond the protection of either nation's laws. The practical challenges were enormous. Medical emergencies meant deciding between illegal border crossing or going without care. Many women gave birth at home because reaching a hospital meant risking arrest. Education presented similar obstacles. Children in many enclaves had no schools at all. Those seeking education risked illegal border crossings daily, often paying bribes to guards. Some families sent children to live with mainland relatives just so they could attend school. Making a living became complicated by geography. A farmer in Dahagram-Garpata might own land requiring crossing into Indian territory. Harvesting crops meant smuggling their own produce across an international border. Each crossing carried the threat of arrest, harassment, or exploitation by officials. Access to electricity, clean water, and telephone service was virtually non-existent in many enclaves. Local governments wouldn't invest in infrastructure for people who weren't their citizens. Police rarely entered these areas, creating lawless pockets where crime flourished. Sometimes criminals from both countries would hide in enclaves to escape prosecution. Residents developed informal systems to cope. They created unofficial local governments, established makeshift courts, and access services through smuggling networks or by bribing officials. Many developed dual identities, operating as citizens of whichever country was most practical at the moment. These invisible people were forgotten by both nations and trapped in geographical purgatory. During floods or natural disasters, neither country would send aid. During religious riots or political unrest, enclave dwellers had nowhere to flee for safety. What created such a bizarre situation? The answer lies in a historical accident involving a chess game and colonial powers who drew borders with little regard for residents. The story begins in the 18th century with a chess match between the Raja of Cooch Behar and the Nawab of Rangpur, two regional rulers in what was then part of the Mughal Empire. According to local legend, these nobles wagered entire villages in their chess games. When one lost a match, he would surrender a village to the winner, creating a patchwork of scattered territories. While historians debate the chess story's accuracy, local rulers did exchange land parcels through various agreements and conflicts. These fragmented territories became more problematic when the British East India Company took control in the late 18th century. The British maintained these arrangements, finding them useful as buffer zones. The crisis worsened in 1947 with India's partition, when British authorities hastily drew borders, creating India and Pakistan, with East Pakistan later becoming Bangladesh. The rushed process failed to resolve the enclave situation, cementing it into international law. When asked about the enclaves, British Lord Mountbatten, who oversaw partition, reportedly replied that small issues would be resolved after independence. Those small issues remained unresolved for nearly 7 decades. Diplomatic efforts to exchange enclaves repeatedly stalled over political concerns until 2015, when India and Bangladesh implemented the Land Boundary Agreement. This historic agreement allowed for an exchange of enclaves, with India transferring 111 enclaves to Bangladesh and Bangladesh transferring 51 enclaves to India. Residents could either move to their country of citizenship or remain and adopt citizenship of the surrounding country. Most chose to stay where they had always lived, but gained citizenship of the surrounding country. After all, many had deeper connections to the country surrounding them than to their technical homeland. They spoke the local language, shared cultural practices with neighbors, and had established livelihoods they didn't want to abandon. For others, particularly Hindus in Bangladeshi enclaves who feared religious discrimination, the agreement meant relocating to India with official status. The implementation wasn't perfect. Some residents reported inadequate compensation for lost property or facing bureaucratic hurdles, but it addressed a centuries-old problem. The exchange ended one of the world's strangest border situations. Thousands received birth certificates, identification cards, and official recognition for the first time. Children could attend school without crossing borders. Farmers could tend fields legally, and families could access healthcare without fear of arrest. Yet the Bangladesh-India border isn't the only place where people find themselves caught in geographical peculiarities. Across Europe, similar situations exist, though with vastly different consequences due to different political relationships between the countries involved. Living in a patchwork nation, Baarle-Nassau and Baarle-Hertog. Unlike the troubled enclaves of the Bangladesh-India border, the towns of Baarle-Nassau and Baarle-Hertog represent a different kind of geographical oddity, one where complexity is embraced rather than resolved. Here, living rooms exist in 2 countries simultaneously, and moving your furniture just a few feet might mean stepping into a different nation with its own laws, taxes, and regulations. The Dutch-Belgian border at Baarle doesn't simply divide the community. It slices through it in a seemingly haphazard patchwork. The area consists of 22 Belgian pieces, Baarle-Hertog, entirely surrounded by the Netherlands, and within those Belgian sections sit another 8 Dutch pieces, Baarle-Nassau. This creates a bewildering jigsaw puzzle of jurisdiction where national identity can change multiple times on a single street, resembling a complex puzzle where each piece operates under its own set of rules. What makes this border situation remarkable is how visible it is in everyday life. Walking through the town, you'll notice white crosses embedded in the pavement marking the exact border lines. These serve as crucial indicators of which countries' laws apply at any given spot. House numbers display small flags, the Belgian tricolor or the Dutch red, white, and blue, indicating which nation claims that particular dwelling. For many buildings, the border runs straight through them, creating practical implications. In one case, a 90-year-old woman resides on the Belgian side of her house, while her son lives down the corridor in the Netherlands. Such arrangements raise questions about jurisdiction. Whose building codes apply when renovating? Which country's emergency services should you call in a crisis? And where do you pay your taxes? The answer to the tax question reveals the creativity that defines life in Baarle. Nationality is determined by the location of your front door. This seemingly arbitrary rule has led to strategic architecture over the years, with homeowners occasionally relocating their main entrance to take advantage of more favorable tax regimes. Move your door a few meters, and you might change your citizenship, tax obligations, and which country's social services you can access. Businesses in Baarle have learned to navigate this peculiar geographic situation. The border running through commercial establishments creates both challenges and opportunities. One supermarket is bisected by the international boundary, with a sign humorously promising Belgian mayonnaise 25 meters to the left and Dutch chocolate sprinkles 30 meters to the right. These Hagelslag chocolate sprinkles, beloved by the Dutch as a breakfast topping, represent one of the cultural differences shoppers encounter as they push their carts across international lines. The postal system presents its own challenges. Since mail delivery follows national systems, the location of your front door determines which country's postal service handles your letters and packages. This detail affects delivery times, postal rates, and which holidays might delay your mail. Local postal workers have developed specialized knowledge of the border's twists and turns to ensure each letter reaches its correct destination. Beyond these daily curiosities lies a deeper reality. Residents have developed a hybrid identity that transcends traditional national boundaries. Many speak both Dutch and French or Flemish, understand the bureaucracy of both countries, and navigate between different cultural norms with ease. They demonstrate how artificial national borders can be, even in the heart of Europe. Criminal jurisdiction becomes particularly complicated when incidents straddle the border. Which country's police force investigates? Which judicial system handles prosecution? These questions have necessitated extensive cooperation between Dutch and Belgian authorities, resulting in specialized cross-border agreements. Tax advantages aside, residents of Baarle exploit the different laws and pricing structures for daily shopping. Petrol and cigarettes tend to be cheaper in Belgium, drawing Dutch customers across those white crosses. Meanwhile, food products often cost less in the Netherlands, creating a reverse flow of Belgian shoppers. This micro-scale border economy shows how even friendly borders create market differentials that people naturally utilize. The practical implications of straddling two nations became particularly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. As Belgium and the Netherlands implemented different restriction policies, restaurants and shops found themselves in a remarkable position. Belgian authorities mandated mask wearing throughout the country, while Dutch rules only required masks on public transport. This created situations where walking from one side of a room to another meant following different public health protocols. Dining establishments faced an even more bizarre scenario. When one country imposed stricter lockdown measures, restaurants with floors divided by the border would shift their tables to the side with more lenient rules. Patrons might begin their meal under Dutch regulations only to find themselves needing to move to the Belgian section, or vice versa, when closing times differed. Half a restaurant might be forced to close, while the other half continued serving customers just steps away. The situation in Baarle differs dramatically from the Bangladesh-India enclaves due to the wider political context. As members of the European Union with decades of peaceful relations, Belgium and the Netherlands have transformed what could be problematic into something closer to a tourist attraction. The VVV Baarle Tourist Office welcomes visitors curious about this geographical anomaly, offering maps and guidance for experiencing the border's peculiarities firsthand. Yet Baarle's quirkiness offers serious lessons about border management worldwide. The creative solutions developed here, from determining nationality by front door placement to flexible business practices during COVID, represent practical responses to an impractical situation. Rather than attempting to rationalize the border, both countries have accepted its complexity and found ways to make it workable. The Baarle model suggests an alternative approach to border anomalies. Embracing their uniqueness while developing special governance arrangements can provide a more humane solution. Local officials from both countries maintain regular communication, creating a form of micro-diplomacy that addresses practical problems without waiting for national governments to intervene. For all its uniqueness, Baarle represents just one example of Europe's complex border landscape. The continent is dotted with similar anomalies, from the German town of Bussingen entirely surrounded by Switzerland to the Spanish exclave of Livia embedded within French territory. Each has forced local communities to develop strategies for handling the practical challenges of divided jurisdiction. Trapped in another country, geographic exclaves. While European enclaves like Baarle showcase peaceful coexistence within divided communities, Point Roberts, Washington presents a far more vulnerable geographic reality. This tiny American community of about 1,000 people occupies just 4.8 square miles at the southern tip of a Canadian peninsula, completely cut off from the rest of the United States. Unlike European border oddities that emerged from centuries of political negotiation, Point Roberts exists because of a simple cartographic decision, the 49th parallel. When American and British negotiators established the boundary between the United States and British North America in 1846, they agreed on the 49th parallel as a clean, straight dividing line across the continent. This mathematical approach to border drawing, prioritizing a ruler straight line over the natural curve of the coastline, created an unexpected consequence. The Tawasin Peninsula extends south from British Columbia, dipping below the 49th parallel before connecting to the mainland. By strictly following the parallel rather than geographical features, negotiators inadvertently created an American exclave, a piece of American territory physically separated from the mainland and only accessible by traveling through Canada. For decades, this geographic anomaly posed minimal problems. Point Roberts developed as a sleepy community with a unique character, technically American, but deeply connected to Canadian commerce and infrastructure. Its isolation even became an asset, hosting participants in the U.S. Federal Witness Protection Program and Americans seeking privacy away from the mainland. The community developed a hybrid identity, with residents comfortable navigating both American and Canadian systems. But when COVID-19 hit in March 2020, this delicate arrangement collapsed. As both countries closed their borders to non-essential travel, Point Roberts residents found themselves truly trapped. The community experienced an existential crisis. The U.S.-Canada border closure meant residents couldn't drive through Canada to reach the mainland United States, nor could Canadians cross into Point Roberts for shopping and services that had sustained the local economy. "I've lived here for 30 years," said one elderly resident, "and suddenly I couldn't even visit my doctor in Bellingham or see my grandchildren on the mainland. We were forgotten, Americans trapped outside America." The pandemic exposed the fragility of life in geographic exclaves. The only grocery store in Point Roberts, the International Marketplace, struggled to remain viable as owner Ollie Hayden reduced operating hours when customer traffic plummeted. With Canadian shoppers, who had comprised roughly 75% of the store's business, unable to cross the border, the community's food security hung by a thread. Education systems also unraveled. Children in Point Roberts typically crossed the international border twice daily to attend school in Blaine, Washington, as the exclave is too small to support its own school district beyond elementary grades. Remote learning became the only option, further isolating younger residents from their peers and educational resources. Some Point Roberts residents, particularly its higher-than-average percentage of retirees, appreciated the quieter pace of life during the pandemic, highlighting the community's divergent interests and needs. The economic impact extended throughout the community. Local businesses dependent on Canadian customers shut down entirely as border restrictions continued. while emergency services had special cross-border arrangements, allowing American ambulances to transport patients through Canadian territory to reach American hospitals. Routine healthcare became problematic. Even with certain medical exemptions for border crossing, documentation requirements created barriers for accessing care. Point Roberts isn't alone in this predicament. Similar geographic anomalies exist worldwide, each with unique challenges. Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave of nearly 1 million people, sits entirely separated from Russia between Poland and Lithuania, creating a situation where Russian citizens must cross international borders just to travel between parts of their own country. Spain's Livia exists as a 5-square-mile Spanish municipality completely surrounded by France. The German town of Bussingen am Hockerhain functions as a German exclave inside Switzerland, using Swiss francs alongside euros and navigating dual systems for everything from healthcare to telecommunications. These geographical oddities highlight a fundamental truth about international borders. They're human constructs often ill-suited to geographic realities and community needs. When borders follow straight lines or mathematical coordinates rather than mountains, rivers, or cultural boundaries, they create dysfunctional spaces where daily life requires constant navigation of international systems. What makes nations maintain these impractical arrangements despite their obvious complications? The answer lies in the international system's strong preference for border stability. Once established, borders gain a powerful inertia. Changing them requires complex negotiations and raises fears of setting precedents for other territorial disputes. Even when both sides recognize the impracticality of a particular border arrangement, the diplomatic and legal hurdles to modification often outweigh the benefits. For residents of these geographic islands, survival depends on special international agreements. Point Roberts relies on provisions allowing residents to transit through Canada without stopping, while Kaliningrad has negotiated specific transit corridors through Lithuania. These arrangements remain vulnerable to political tensions between the surrounding and parent countries, a reality made painfully clear during the pandemic. The economic viability of these communities depends almost entirely on their relationships with surrounding territories. When those relationships are disrupted, as during border closures, the community's economic foundation crumbles. Perhaps most poignantly, these geographic anomalies create communities with split identities. Residents simultaneously belong to their parent nation while being practically dependent on the surrounding country. They often develop cultural affinities with both nations, speaking multiple languages and navigating different legal systems with a fluency most citizens never develop. This dual identity becomes part of the community's character, with residents developing a unique perspective on nationality and belonging. The pandemic forced exclaves to confront existential questions about their future viability. As supply chains were disrupted and normal movement patterns halted, communities like Point Roberts had to reckon with whether their unusual geographic situation remained sustainable in a world where borders might close with little warning. The challenges faced by exclaves offer important insights about citizenship, community resilience, and the artificiality of international boundaries. While many borders worldwide follow natural features or cultural divisions, these geographic anomalies reveal how arbitrary lines on maps can create real no man's land, the UN buffer zone in Cyprus. While artificial borders create challenges for residents of exclaves, a far more unsettling reality exists when a border becomes so contested that nobody can claim the space between. In Cyprus, this manifests as a 112-mile scar cutting across the island, a United Nations buffer zone where time has literally frozen since 1974, creating neighborhoods, businesses, and even an international airport trapped in a diplomatic void that officially doesn't exist on any map. Known locally as the Green Line, this demilitarized zone was established after Turkish forces invaded northern Cyprus following a Greek-backed coup. What began as a temporary measure in 1974 has persisted for 50 years, becoming one of the longest-running UN peacekeeping missions in history. The buffer zone varies dramatically, from just a few meters wide in Nicosia's urban center to several kilometers in rural areas, encompassing about 3% of Cyprus's total land area, roughly equivalent to the size of Manhattan. "I was 7 when we fled," recalls Marina Christou, whose family home stands just inside the buffer zone in Nicosia. "My mother told me to pack one bag for the weekend. That weekend has lasted my entire life. I can see our family home from my apartment window, but I cannot touch the doorknob or sit under the lemon tree my grandfather planted." Walking through the buffer zone today is like entering a time capsule. Former homes stand exactly as they were abandoned, with personal possessions still visible through windows, dishes on tables, clothes in closets, photos on walls. Shops display products with 1970s packaging and pricing. Streets designed for bustling commerce now host only UN patrols and wildlife that has reclaimed the territory in the absence of human activity. The buffer zone contains Nicosia International Airport, once Cyprus's primary aviation hub, now a ghostly monument to the conflict. Passenger aircraft remain on the tarmac, trapped in perpetual delay since the day the fighting began. The terminal building, once a symbol of the island's tourism economy, stands abandoned with decades-old departure schedules still displayed, announcing flights that never took off. For the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus, UNFICYP, monitoring this no-man's land is a constant challenge. Using an array of vehicles, foot patrols, bicycles, and helicopters, peacekeepers maintain continuous surveillance throughout the buffer zone. A highly mobile unit stands ready to respond to emergencies, providing security in an area that experiences approximately 1,000 incidents annually, ranging from verbal altercations to unauthorized firearm use. The buffer zone isn't entirely uninhabited. Several villages exist within this diplomatic gray area, creating complex jurisdictional puzzles for residents. Farmers require UN permission and often military escorts to access their fields. Construction projects face unique hurdles as UNFICYP must consider security implications, property ownership, and operational requirements before approving any development. One such village is Pylos/Pyle, a rare bicommunal settlement where Greek and Turkish Cypriots live side by side. In August 2023, tensions flared when Turkish Cypriot construction personnel clashed with UN peacekeepers on the plateau above the village. Though Special Representative Colin Stewart announced in October 2023 that an understanding had been reached between the two sides to resolve the situation, implementation has been suspended for over a year. The human impact of this division extends far beyond practical inconveniences. Families separated by the buffer zone have spent decades unable to return to ancestral homes. Properties remain legally owned by displaced persons who cannot access them. Businesses built over generations stand abandoned, their owners watching from a distance as time and nature gradually reclaim them. Perhaps the most striking example is Varosha, once a glamorous beach resort frequented by celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. When Turkish forces advanced in 1974, its 39,000 residents fled, expecting to return within days. Instead, the area was fenced off, and for decades, entry was forbidden to everyone except Turkish military personnel. The result is a surreal urban landscape where high-rise hotels stand empty, department stores showcase 1970s fashions, and luxury cars gather dust in underground garages, a Mediterranean Pompeii frozen by political deadlock. The ecological consequences of this unusual situation have been unexpectedly positive. With limited human interference, the buffer zone has become a sanctuary for wildlife. Endemic plant species flourish, and rare animals thrive in this accidental nature reserve. Researchers have documented biodiversity hotspots within the zone, including species that have become endangered elsewhere on the island. For those living alongside the green line, psychological impacts accumulate over generations. Children grow up with visible reminders of conflict directly outside their windows. Grandparents tell stories of homes and businesses they once owned just meters away but cannot visit. The constant presence of military checkpoints, guard towers, and warning signs creates a persistent awareness of division. Despite these challenges, recent diplomatic developments offer cautious hope. In October 2023, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot leaders agreed to convene another informal meeting under UN auspices. They also discussed potentially opening new crossings along the ceasefire lines, which could facilitate greater interaction between communities. The humanitarian dimension of the buffer zone continues to evolve. In September 2024, Greek Cypriot authorities began accepting asylum seekers from countries including Somalia and Syria who had been stranded in the buffer zone. By November, this situation was resolved, demonstrating that cooperation remains possible despite broader political tensions. For residents navigating daily life near the buffer zone, a complex system of permits and checkpoints governs movement. Those living within villages inside the buffer zone must register with UNFICYP. Farmers seeking to tend lands within the zone require specific authorizations. Construction or renovation projects face additional scrutiny. Yet amid these restrictions, communities have developed remarkable adaptations. Some villages have established bicommunal initiatives that bring Greek and Turkish Cypriots together despite official division. Environmental projects, cultural exchanges, and business partnerships operate across the buffer zone, creating connections that official politics has failed to achieve. The ceasefire lines remain heavily militarized, with both sides maintaining surveillance equipment and conducting operations that sometimes disregard the UN's authority. In January 2024, the UN Security Council extended UNFICYP's mandate until January 31st, 2026, affirming the continued importance of this mission nearly 5 decades after its creation. For outsiders, the Cyprus buffer zone may seem like a historical curiosity, a Cold War relic persisting into the 21st century. For Cypriots, however, it represents a daily reality that shapes everything from practical travel arrangements to deeper questions of identity and belonging. The paradox of living beside a place that officially doesn't exist creates unique psychological and practical challenges unknown in more conventional border regions. The Central Asian border maze. The paradox of unrecognized spaces in Cyprus pales in comparison to what happens when borders are deliberately designed to divide and control populations. In Central Asia's Fergana Valley, Soviet mapmakers created what might be the world's most convoluted border system, where villages, water sources, and roads were strategically separated to prevent unified resistance, leaving a deadly legacy that continues to this day. Unlike messy borders drawn by distant colonial powers, the Fergana Valley represents a labyrinth of lines deliberately engineered to trap communities and fragment identity. Residents navigate a reality where morning commutes require crossing international boundaries. Accessing farmland means confronting checkpoints, and water, agriculture's lifeblood, flows through pipes crossing multiple sovereign territories before reaching fields. The valley's borders weren't drawn by accident. In the 1920s and 1930s, Stalin's regime methodically divided the historically unified Fergana Valley among 3 Soviet socialist republics, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The calculated goal was preventing the formation of a unified Central Asian identity that might challenge Moscow's authority. The resulting border arrangement created a jigsaw puzzle where enclaves, territories entirely surrounded by another country, became diplomatic flashpoints. The Fergana Valley contains 6 major enclaves across the 3 countries. Sok, an Uzbek territory with over 70,000 residents, sits fully encircled by Kyrgyzstan. Vorak, a Tajik community of approximately 30,000, finds itself similarly isolated inside Kyrgyzstan, connected to Tajikistan proper only via mountain passes often impassable during winter. These artificial divisions transform everyday activities into diplomatic incidents. Farmers wake up in one country but find their fields in another. Family visits require multiple border crossings, each with bureaucratic hurdles. Telephone networks frequently fail across boundaries, isolating communities from their governments. Water management becomes particularly problematic in this arid region dependent on irrigation. Soviet engineers built elaborate canal systems, now crossing multiple international boundaries. Upstream countries controlling headwaters gain leverage over downstream farms. Water infrastructure becomes weaponized in disputes, with countries occasionally cutting supply for political pressure. This water conflict sparked deadly violence in April 2021 at the Головной distribution point on the Isfara River. What began as a dispute over access escalated into armed conflict between Kyrgyz and Tajik forces. The violence killed dozens, destroyed homes, and displaced thousands of civilians, the worst border violence the region had seen in years. September 2022 brought another wave of bloodshed along the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border. Artillery and small arms fire transformed peaceful villages into conflict zones as military forces exchanged fire across disputed territories. These conflicts reflect economic reality. The Fergana Valley contains Central Asia's most fertile and densely populated areas. With scarce land and growing populations, competition intensifies for resources increasingly stressed by climate change. The human toll extends beyond violence. Communities find themselves cut off from nearby markets, hospitals, and schools that lie across political boundaries. Medical emergencies require complex negotiations to cross borders, sometimes with fatal delays. Students face impossible choices between foregoing education or relocating entirely. During Soviet times, these borders existed primarily on paper, with free movement within the single Soviet state. The USSR's 1991 collapse transformed administrative divisions into international borders overnight, complete with customs controls and passport requirements. The situation deteriorated as newly independent republics restricted movement. Simple roads became fortified checkpoints with armed guards and documentation requirements. Many rural residents who never needed international passports found themselves effectively trapped in their villages. Visa requirements compounded these challenges. Despite various bilateral agreements, many rural residents lack documentation, knowledge, or resources to navigate complex applications. Visiting relatives just miles away might require traveling to distant capitals, considerable expenses, and weeks of waiting. This border maze creates perverse economic incentives. Smuggling thrives where legitimate trade is restricted and corruption flourishes at checkpoints. Communities once engaged in mutual trade turn to black markets, undermining economic development and government authority. Perhaps most troubling are the psychological effects. Ethnic Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks, who once lived as neighbors, now find themselves citizens of competing nations. Centuries-old cultural and familial ties strain under nationalist rhetoric and border disputes. Despite these entrenched problems, recent diplomatic breakthroughs offer hope. In March 2024, a historic summit in Kujand, Tajikistan, brought together all three countries' presidents to sign the agreement on the junction point of the state borders, aiming to resolve territorial disputes dating to independence. The summit produced the Kujand Declaration of Eternal Friendship and a symbolic stele at the junction point of the three borders. These gestures were backed by substantial agreements, particularly between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who finalized demarcation of their entire 1,006-kilometer frontier. This agreement addresses long-standing tensions by reopening vital trade routes and establishing shared water management. The Kizilbel and Kayragak checkpoints, closed since 2021, will resume operations, reconnecting severed communities. A bilateral commission will oversee the Isfara River Basin, the water source that sparked the 2021 violence. The agreement includes land swaps, particularly around Vorik. These exchanges aim to create more coherent territories reflecting community needs rather than Soviet political calculations. For some villages, this means relocation, disruptive but preferable to perpetual insecurity. Can these diplomatic efforts succeed where previous attempts failed? The challenge remains immense. The paper agreements must translate to ground-level changes where generations of conflict have fostered deep mistrust. What makes recent agreements potentially more durable is their comprehensive approach, addressing entire frontiers while simultaneously tackling resource sharing. By linking border recognition with economic cooperation, countries create mutual incentives for upholding commitments. The March 2024 agreement recognizes that regional prosperity depends on cooperation rather than competition. For citizens trapped in border zones, these diplomatic breakthroughs offer the first realistic hope in generations for normalized relations and simplified daily life. Citizens of nowhere, the human cost of border anomalies. Beyond the physical barriers of checkpoints and border walls lies a more insidious boundary, the line between recognized personhood and legal invisibility. What does it mean when your birthplace, your home, and your identity exist in a space that no country acknowledges? For hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, border anomalies have erased their legal existence entirely. Statelessness, the condition of having no nationality recognized by any country, represents perhaps the most profound human cost of border complexities. While diplomatic agreements may eventually resolve territorial disputes between nations, they rarely address the immediate reality faced by those caught in between. These individuals exist in a bureaucratic void, unable to prove their legal identity or claim the protections and rights that citizenship normally confers. Consider the experience of those living in formerly disputed territories. When borders shift or enclaves change hands, residents often find themselves without the documentation necessary to establish citizenship. Their birth certificates, if they exist at all, may reference places or political entities that no longer exist. The buildings where records were stored might have been destroyed in conflict or simply abandoned during territorial transitions. For many, the paper trail that would connect them to a recognized nation-state simply vanishes. The implications of this documentary absence extend far beyond mere inconvenience. Without proof of identity, accessing even the most fundamental services becomes nearly impossible. Healthcare systems typically require identification for treatment. Educational institutions demand birth certificates for enrollment. Employment opportunities disappear when employers require work permits or national identification numbers. Basic financial services remain out of reach without recognized identification. "I am a ghost," explained one stateless woman from a contested border region. "My grandparents' home became part of a different country overnight. Now I cannot prove I belong anywhere. I exist, I breathe, I feel, but officially I am nobody." The most troubling aspect of statelessness is its tendency to perpetuate across generations. Children born to stateless parents typically inherit their parents' precarious status, creating cycles of exclusion that can persist for decades. Without birth registration, a fundamental right under international conventions, these children begin life in a documentation vacuum. Their births go unrecorded in official systems, making it extraordinarily difficult for them to later establish legal identity. Even where birthright citizenship might theoretically apply, proving birth location becomes nearly impossible without official records. In some border regions, residents may technically hold citizenship but lack the practical means to prove it. When administrative centers are located far from isolated enclaves, residents may never register births or obtain identification documents. The journey to administrative offices might require crossing international boundaries, a circular problem when the very documents needed for such crossings are what residents seek to obtain. The limitations imposed by statelessness constrain nearly every aspect of life. Travel, legal marriage, voting rights, social security access, education opportunities, and legal protection all depend on having recognized documentation. These restrictions effectively confine stateless individuals to the margins of society, vulnerable to exploitation, and unable to fully participate in community life. Employers exploit their precarious status with dangerous working conditions. Landlords charge excessive rents for substandard housing. Even accessing justice systems becomes difficult, creating environments where crime against stateless populations goes unreported. For women in stateless communities, gender discrimination often compounds these challenges. In regions where citizenship passes primarily through paternal lines, women may be unable to confer citizenship to their children even if they themselves hold nationality. If their stateless children's fathers are absent, these mothers watch their children inherit a legal void not of their making. The psychological impact of statelessness creates profound stress. Stateless individuals describe feelings of shame, anxiety, and helplessness. The identity crisis extends beyond legal status to affect one's fundamental sense of self and place in the world. You question your value as a human being, explained one stateless man. You wonder if you matter to anyone when no country acknowledges your existence. Even when diplomatic solutions emerge for contested territories, resolving statelessness remains complex. Those without documentation to prove residence often find themselves excluded from citizenship pathways. Application processes may require fees, language proficiency, or cultural knowledge tests that create barriers for marginalized populations. The very people most in need of resolution often have the least access to the mechanisms designed to provide it. Some regions have developed innovative approaches to address the documentation gap. Mobile registration units bring administrative services directly to remote communities. Simplified documentation requirements account for displacement realities. Witness testimony systems, where community members verify an individual's identity, offer alternative pathways when traditional documentation is unavailable. International frameworks provide potential solutions. The 1954 and 1961 conventions established baseline protections and recognition pathways. However, implementation remains inconsistent, with many countries having neither signed these conventions nor incorporated their principles into domestic law. Success stories do exist. Thailand's efforts with Hill tribe communities demonstrate that with sufficient political will, even long-standing situations can improve. By establishing flexible documentation requirements, Thailand has reduced statelessness significantly. Similarly, Kenya's Makan community, originally from Mozambique but resident in Kenya for generations, finally received citizenship recognition in 2016 after decades of advocacy. These successes highlight the critical importance of both policy reforms and grassroots advocacy. When stateless communities organize while engaging with sympathetic officials, sustainable solutions become possible. International organizations often provide technical expertise and accountability mechanisms supporting domestic reforms. Technology offers new possibilities for addressing documentation gaps. Digital identity systems can provide recognizable identification even before formal citizenship determinations. Blockchain-based solutions show promise for creating immutable identity records that persist across political transitions. Biometric systems may help connect individuals to their records even when paper documentation has been lost. Yet technology alone cannot solve the fundamental political questions underlying statelessness. The core issue remains one of human recognition, the willingness of nation-states to acknowledge the humanity and rights of those who live at the margins of their systems. This recognition requires confronting the uncomfortable reality that our border systems, designed to create order, often produce colonial precisely legacies, the opposite effect created for the most vulnerable border problems. This cycle of invisibility didn't begin yesterday. It was set in motion generations ago by colonial powers who treated the map as their canvas and sovereignty as their paint. When borders are drawn by people who will never live within them, the consequences echo through centuries. The statistical absence of stateless people from official records masks a deeper historical truth. Their predicament was engineered in conference rooms far from the territories being divided. Picture this. Men in tailored suits huddled around tables in Berlin in 1884, carving up the African continent with rulers and pencils. A cartographic surgery performed by doctors who had never seen their patient. Most had never set foot on African soil. They drew straight lines across deserts, mountains, and river basins with little regard for the hundreds of ethnic groups, kingdoms, and existing political structures their lines bisected. This scramble for Africa transformed the continent's map almost overnight, with over 10,000 political entities consolidated into roughly 50 colonial territories over just a few decades. These arbitrary borders cut through communities like a knife without a compass of empathy. The Maasai found themselves divided between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The Hausa people were split between French Niger and British Nigeria. The Somali people were fragmented across 5 different territories. These divisions dismantled centuries-old trade networks, governance systems, and cultural connections, creating the foundation for today's statelessness crises. Colonial cartographers prioritized convenience and imperial interest over local consultation. Straight lines required no knowledge of local geography and could be easily drawn on maps. When natural features were used as boundaries, they often became sources of future conflict rather than stability. Rivers that changed course created confusion about territorial boundaries. Mountain ranges with complex topography left ambiguous zones that would later spark border disputes. In many cases, division was deliberate policy. Colonial administrators separated ethnic groups across different territories to prevent unified resistance. The divide and rule strategy weakened indigenous power structures by forcing peoples who shared language, culture, and history to develop separate administrative identities. These fragmentations created vulnerable populations whose citizenship would later be contested or denied entirely. The creation of Iraq after World War I illustrates this problem. British administrators combined 3 Ottoman provinces with distinct religious and ethnic compositions, Kurdish, Sunni Arab, and Shia Arab populations, to secure access to oil fields and strategic waterways rather than create a cohesive political entity. This artificial construction laid the groundwork for decades of internal conflict and marginalized communities. The partition of India in 1947 exemplifies the traumatic consequences of hasty border drawing. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India before, was given just 5 weeks to determine the boundary between India and Pakistan. Working with outdated maps and census data, he created borders that displaced approximately 14 million people and triggered violence that killed up to 2 million. Today, communities along these borders still struggle with questions of belonging and documentation, creating new generations of effectively stateless people. When colonial powers withdrew, they left behind borders that made little sense yet proved remarkably difficult to change. The legal principle of uti possidetis juris, as you possess under law, freezes colonial borders at the moment of independence. This principle, while intended to prevent territorial conflicts, effectively sanctified colonial border decisions. It prioritized stability over the creation of more logical or equitable divisions that might better reflect ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. The consequences reverberate today. The Tuareg people, traditional nomads of the Sahara, found themselves citizens of 5 different countries: Mali, Niger, Algeria, Libya, and Burkina Faso. Their traditional migration routes suddenly became illegal border crossings. Their unified culture was forced to fragment along national lines, creating vulnerabilities that contribute directly to documentation problems and contested citizenship. This fragmentation created practical problems that persist today. Different education systems mean children receive instruction in different languages. Healthcare systems don't coordinate across these borders. Economic policies differ on either side of these lines, disrupting traditional trade patterns. Border regions frequently become militarized zones where civilians face harassment, restrictions on movement, and economic marginalization. When post-colonial nations attempted to address these inherited border problems, they found themselves constrained by international pressure to maintain the status quo. The 2015 India-Bangladesh Land Boundary Agreement took 68 years to implement, more than half a century during which enclave residents lived in documentation limbo, many effectively stateless. The paradox is striking. Borders created with minimal local input during colonization became almost impossible to modify after independence. While colonial powers could redraw maps with impunity, post-colonial nations found themselves bound by an international system that treated these same arbitrary boundaries as sacrosanct. This rigidity perpetuates statelessness as communities caught between contested territories or straddling borders find their citizenship questioned from all sides. Some regions have found partial solutions through cross-border cooperation agreements, special administrative zones, or economic integration. But these approaches treat symptoms rather than addressing the fundamental problem of borders that make little geographical, cultural, or economic sense. The legacy of colonial border drawing actively shapes contemporary politics, economics, and identity formation. When we observe ethnic conflicts, separatist movements, or regional tensions in formerly colonized regions, we're witnessing the long aftermath of territorial decisions made in European capitals a century or more ago. For stateless populations, these ghostly lines drawn on maps by long-dead colonial administrators determine whether they can access education, healthcare, employment, or protection under the law. The arbitrary pen strokes of yesterday become the barriers to recognition today, solving the unsolvable border resolution attempts. Those colonial ghosts may linger, but they're not invincible. When India and Bangladesh finally resolved their border complexity in 2015, they transformed the lives of 50,000 people who had existed in a diplomatic no-man's land for generations. What makes some border disputes solvable, while others remain frozen in time? The resolution of the India-Bangladesh border represents one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the 21st century. For thousands of residents given the opportunity to choose their citizenship, this agreement redrew lines on a map and fundamentally shifted their existence. The population movements tell a compelling story about identity and belonging. Nearly 14,000 residents of former Bangladeshi enclaves chose Indian citizenship, while approximately 36,000 people in former Indian enclaves became Bangladeshi citizens. Only about 1,000 individuals opted to relocate to India rather than become Bangladeshi nationals. These numbers reveal something profound about geography and identity. The vast majority chose to remain physically where they were while changing their legal nationality to match their surroundings. After generations in legal limbo, most preferred the certainty of belonging to the nation that physically surrounded them rather than maintaining a connection to a country they could only reach by crossing international boundaries. Implementation challenges extended far beyond citizenship paperwork. Property rights needed establishment in legal systems where many residents never possessed formal documentation. Schools and healthcare facilities required integration into new national systems. Infrastructure neglected for decades demanded rapid development. Most critically, government services had to reach communities effectively invisible to both nations for generations. What enabled this resolution after nearly 7 decades of failed negotiations? The answer combines political will, changing regional dynamics, and recognition of the human cost of continued stalemate. Both nations ultimately recognized that the status quo served neither country's interests, with the administrative burden outweighing any perceived strategic advantage. Border resolution strategies vary significantly across different regions and circumstances, demonstrating there's no universal template for solving these complex problems. While complete territorial exchanges worked for India and Bangladesh, other regions have developed alternative methods. Free movement zones maintain official borders while eliminating practical barriers to crossing them. Special economic arrangements create shared prosperity across boundaries. Joint administration allows for cooperative governance of disputed areas. The Schengen area exemplifies ambitious and successful border problem solving. This arrangement effectively eliminates many practical border challenges among participating European countries through passport-free travel. The Schengen Agreement has transformed daily life across much of Europe, streamlining movement and trade while fostering greater integration. Its value lies in acknowledging both sovereign borders and the impracticality of rigid barriers between deeply interconnected communities. This success demonstrates how functional sovereignty can be maintained while eliminating border frictions. Travelers cross multiple national boundaries without passport control, while each nation retains its distinct legal systems, governance structures, and national identity. This approach recognizes that borders serve multiple functions, defining legal jurisdictions, securing territory, and expressing national identity, and that not all require physical barriers or controls. even in regions with entrenched conflicts, progress sometimes emerges unexpectedly. In March 2024, the presidents of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan declared an end to their territorial disputes, marking a potential turning point for a region long plagued by border conflicts. This agreement aims to resolve decades of tension rooted in Soviet-era delimitation that disregarded local ethnic and geographic factors. The Central Asian Agreement addresses some of the world's most complex border situations, a maze of enclaves, disputed territories, and contested resources that have repeatedly triggered violent confrontations. By committing to demarcating a 1,006-kilometer frontier and establishing bilateral commissions to manage shared resources like the Isfara River Basin, these nations are attempting to transform one of the world's most convoluted border regions into a model of regional cooperation. While territorial exchanges and formal agreements represent traditional approaches, innovative solutions are emerging to address humanitarian concerns without necessarily resolving underlying territorial disputes. The United States has pioneered several such approaches to migration challenges. The U.S. State Department's safe mobility offices throughout Latin America provide a novel solution to migration pressures. These regional processing centers screen potential immigrants, refugees, and temporary workers before they attempt dangerous border crossings. By identifying candidates for expedited resettlement, these centers address humanitarian needs while deterring irregular migration patterns. Sponsorship programs represent another innovative approach. The Uniting for Ukraine program and humanitarian parole for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans have enabled the United States to welcome more than 330,000 vulnerable migrants through orderly, legal pathways. Similarly, the Welcome Corps initiative allows private citizens to sponsor refugees directly. These programs demonstrate that addressing human needs sometimes requires looking beyond traditional conceptions of borders and sovereignty. Rather than focusing exclusively on territorial control, these approaches prioritize humanitarian concerns. What enables border resolution in some cases while others remain intractable? The evidence suggests several critical factors. First, resolution requires political leadership willing to expend political capital on controversial compromises. Second, timing matters. Resolution often becomes possible during periods of regional cooperation or when external pressures create incentives for settlement. Third, successful resolution almost always includes meaningful consultation with affected communities rather than imposing solutions from distant capitals. Perhaps most importantly, successful resolution requires a fundamental shift in perspective, from viewing borders as expressions of sovereignty and security to seeing them as human spaces where communities live and build relationships. When borders are recognized as lived realities affecting daily human experiences, practical solutions become more apparent. For communities caught in border disputes, resolution often arrives too late for generations who lived their entire lives in limbo. The elderly residents of the Bangladesh-India enclaves who finally received citizenship experienced resolution as a bittersweet victory, recognition after lifetimes of exclusion. This human timeline underscores the urgency of addressing border anomalies. Not all resolution attempts succeed. Some fail because of security concerns, others because territorial concessions remain politically toxic. Religious sites, natural resources, and strategic locations often complicate resolution. Historical grievances can make territorial compromise feel like surrendering national identity. In some cases, complete resolution may not be necessary or desirable. Some border anomalies have developed unique cultural identities that residents prefer to maintain. Beyond conventional diplomatic approaches, emerging innovations promise to reshape how we understand and manage the world's most complex borders, a topic we'll explore in depth next. Beyond borders, rethinking sovereignty. The rigid borders we've traced throughout this video might not be the inevitable solution they appear to be. When we examine the concept of national sovereignty itself, the idea that a single government should exercise exclusive control over a clearly defined territory, We find it's a relatively recent development in human history, and perhaps not the only way to organize our world. Throughout most of human existence, governance worked quite differently. Medieval Europe operated with overlapping authorities where kings, lords, the church, and guilds all exercised different forms of power over the same territories. Citizens owed allegiance to multiple authorities depending on the specific matter at hand. This arrangement functioned effectively for centuries, showing us concrete alternatives to our modern assumptions about territorial control. Before the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia established the foundation for today's concept of territorial sovereignty, political power was understood as authority over people rather than exclusive control of land. A ruler's domain was defined by who owed allegiance rather than by precisely where their territory ended. Indigenous concepts of territory present another alternative to our current understanding of borders. Many indigenous traditions emphasize a multifaceted relationship with land that transcends the Western notion of exclusive ownership. These perspectives view territory through spiritual, cultural, and economic connections rather than through rigid boundary lines. The relationship is one of responsibility and stewardship rather than possession and control. For indigenous communities, boundaries were often zones of transition rather than hard lines of separation. Different groups might share hunting grounds, spiritual sites, or trade routes without establishing exclusive control. When European colonizers arrived with their maps and border markers, they fundamentally misunderstood these flexible arrangements, imposing Western concepts of ownership that continue to create conflicts today. What if our modern fixation with exclusive territorial control, where every square inch of land must belong to exactly one country, is more limited than we realize? The notion that governance must align perfectly with geography is not a universal truth, but a particular cultural and historical development. Today, we see alternative sovereignty models emerging around the world. Condominium arrangements, where two or more states share sovereignty over a territory, offer one alternative. The historical condominium of the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu, operated under joint British and French administration for 74 years before independence, creating dual systems for everything from courts to postal services. Special administrative regions like Hong Kong and Macau demonstrate another approach. These territories maintain distinct legal systems, currencies, and governance structures while existing within a larger state. Hong Kong's separate legal system, currency, and even driving side, they drive on the left, while mainland China drives on the right, show how sovereignty can be exercised differently across a country's territory. These arrangements offer practical templates for addressing some of our most intractable border conflicts. The functional sovereignty concept suggests that different aspects of governance could be handled by different entities based on what works best. Could water resources in disputed territories be managed by transnational river authorities rather than competing national governments? Might cultural heritage sites be administered by the communities with historical connections to them rather than whatever nation currently controls the territory? The European Union represents perhaps the most ambitious modern experiment in reimagining sovereignty. While maintaining member states as distinct nations, it creates a supranational layer of governance for matters like trade, currency, and movement of people. A resident of Strasbourg can work in Germany, use a common currency, and enjoy protections from EU-wide regulations while still being a French citizen. These flexible arrangements are particularly relevant to the unusual border situations we've explored throughout this video. The residents of complex border communities like Baarle-Nassau / Baarle-Hertog have created their own form of practical sovereignty that transcends the national boundaries running through their town. Their local cooperation agreements and dual identities offer lessons for other divided communities. Digital citizenship presents yet another departure from traditional territorial sovereignty. Online communities develop their own governance systems, shared identities, and decision-making processes that operate independently of geography. A programmer in Nairobi might feel more connected to their open-source software community than to their physical neighbors, participating more actively in governance of their online platform than in local elections. This doesn't mean territorial borders will disappear. Physical control of land remains fundamental to security, resource management, and many aspects of daily life. But these alternative models reveal that exclusive. Territorial sovereignty is just one way to organize human societies. The rigid borders that create the anomalies we've explored, the enclaves, exclaves, buffer zones, and complex demarcations, show the limitations of trying to divide a continuous planet into discrete national containers. When we examine border anomalies closely, we find communities adapting with creative solutions that involve informal sharing of authority and cooperative arrangements between different governments. The future of sovereignty likely involves a more complex tapestry of overlapping authorities rather than the simple colored blocks we see on political maps. Some functions of governance may move upward to regional or global institutions better equipped to handle transnational issues like climate change, while others may devolve to local communities with distinct needs and identities. For residents of places like the Fergana Valley, where artificial borders have created enclaves that complicate access to water and essential services, alternative sovereignty models offer practical solutions without requiring complete redrawing of national boundaries. Shared management of resources, special transit arrangements, or zones of cooperation could address immediate human needs while respecting existing national identities. The key insight from studying border anomalies isn't that borders should be eliminated, but that they should serve human communities rather than the other way around. When borders become obstacles to human flourishing, preventing access to education, healthcare, or economic opportunity, we should reconsider how sovereignty operates in those spaces. This perspective invites us to move beyond viewing borders solely as expressions of national power and instead see them as frameworks for organizing human cooperation. The most successful responses to border anomalies have been those that prioritize practical solutions for affected communities over rigid adherence to sovereign exclusivity. Throughout our journey, we've seen how arbitrary lines on maps have created real human consequences, from the India-Bangladesh enclaves to the Central Asian border maze. These geographical oddities are reminders of how political decisions can fragment communities and complicate lives for generations. The 2015 land boundary agreement between India and Bangladesh shows diplomatic solutions are possible, but the most profound resolution comes from cultivating empathy for those caught between these divisions. What if we valued human needs over the lines we've drawn? As you look at borders on a map tomorrow, remember each line represents